Well, my name is Mark Garrett. I'm the Director General here in the Law Society for those I haven't met before. So you're all very welcome and thank you for taking the time to join us here today. We're going to talk about the Justice Indicator Report, which was published by the Law Society and our Centre for Justice and Law Reform here in Blackwell Place in February. And we can go through some of the details of that. The format will be, I'm joined by two colleagues, Ray Byrne, who is on the advisory board of the Centre for Justice and Law Reform. He's a barrister and former full-time commissioner and former director of research at the Law Reform Commission and adjunct professor of law at the Southern School of Law in UCD. And also by colleague Suzanne Scott, who is the head of research here in the Law Society. Forgive her, she's also a barrister, but also has been the lead researcher on the Justice Indicators report. So the format will be, we'll give the floor to both Suzanne and Ray for about 20-25 minutes, just to go through some of the details of the Justice Indicator report. And then we'll have a Q&A session where I'll facilitate some of the questions that you may be interested in asking. Some people have already submitted questions, and I please encourage you to do so through the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. And then we'll give an opportunity to have a discussion around some of those questions. A couple of housekeeping points is, first of all, just to say this session is being recorded and it will be circulated to anybody who has signed up for the webinar and be available on our website afterwards. The presentation that will be given here today will also be circulated for everybody who's signed up for the webinar, so that'll be available for the details. So if you don't catch any of the details from some of the graphics, be assured that you will get the presentation afterwards. I suppose just a very quick introduction. I mean, why the Centre for Justice and Law Reform and why Justice Indicators? From the Law Society's perspective, just so you're aware, the Centre for Justice and Law Reform was established last year. It's a new initiative here in the Law Society to provide evidence-based research from the Law Society, from the expertise of the legal profession to help shape the justice system here in Ireland. You'll see a programme of work including the Justice Indicators report that we're about to discuss, and a range of other topics in the future to fulfill its mandate. And why the Justice Indicators? I mean, ultimately, we can't understand if the justice system is working if we're not able to compare it with the data that is available, but also comparison with other jurisdictions. I know Suzanne and Ray will go through some of the details, but this is about providing evidence for evidence-based decision-making to help understand where the Irish justice system is at across a number of indicators, and also to help improve policymakers' decision-making when it comes to the investment of time, energy, and of course, resources in our justice system. So that's the broad background, but maybe it's worth getting into the detail of it. So at this stage, I'll hand over to Suzanne, who will share a presentation and go through some of the detail of the Justice Indicators report. Thank you, Suzanne.
Thanks so much, Mark. I'm just going to share my screen, so bear with me 2 seconds. 1 second. Now, hopefully we should have the presentation there. So the first slide here, as you see, this sets out all 15 of the justice indicators that we assessed in this research paper, and you'll see that we focused on 3 core aspects of the justice system, those being policing, the courts and prisons. And we also looked at trust and confidence across that section of the justice system. Now, we are very keenly aware that the justice system is much broader than just this section that we've analysed, but this is a starting point from which to work. And it's probably worth noting at the outset that this is simply the first publication in what will be an annual series that will revisit, update the data, and potentially also expand the scope to include additional aspects of the justice system, for example, potentially alternative dispute resolution or the probation services. So we're not going to take you through each and every one of these indicators today. We've just taken a selection of the findings, and between Ray and myself, we'll highlight some of the interesting findings. And before I get into those findings, however, worth mentioning the methodological approach that we took towards our assessment. So we applied a traffic light assessment in order to benchmark Ireland against other jurisdictions. Predominantly, we used either the European Union average or the Council of Europe average as the benchmark, depending on the availability of data. And you'll see, for example, the red light was used where Ireland deviates by more than 10% from that benchmark. Amber signifies Ireland is within 3 and 10% of the benchmark, and green highlights where Ireland is either on par with or within 3% of the benchmark. And then we also use white, although that's not, you won't see that in standard traffic lights unless the light is broken. But white indicates that the data at present that are available are insufficient to make an informed assessment. So using this approach, it was a transparent and objective analysis based on numerical deviation, as opposed to having any judgment or subjectivity based into the analysis. So the first indicators that I'm going to highlight to you pertain to trust and confidence in the justice system, and they're predominantly positive findings. So firstly, we looked at trust in An Garda Síochána, and to do so, we took data from the OECD survey of trust in public institutions. And you'll see we have data from 2021 and 2023. The 2021 data are in the light green and the 2023 data are in the dark green. And you'll see that in 2023, roughly 70% of Irish people indicated that they trusted An Garda Síochána. And this compares very favourably with the OECD average of approximately 63%, which you'll see on the far right of that slide. Now, in contrast to what I just said about the assessment, the deviation between those two numbers is greater than 10%. However, on our analysis, we came to the conclusion that a higher level of trust was an inherently positive finding. And for this indicator, it is assessed as green, despite being more than a 10% deviation. In addition to the overall OECD average, we also looked at some individual jurisdictions. So you'll see, for example, the United Kingdom in 2023, 56% of its population had trust in its police force, which is below that of Ireland. And the same for Denmark, slightly higher at 69%, but lower than Ireland. And we are relatively on par with New Zealand at 70.9%. There's a difference of just 0.5%. And turning to trust in the courts and the judiciary, again, we use data from the same OECD survey, and we have data from 2021 and 2023. For Ireland, approximately 69% of the Irish population indicated that they trusted the courts and the judiciary. And again, this compares quite favourably with the OECD average at 54%. And similarly, while the deviation between those two figures is more than 10%, a higher level of trust in the courts and the judiciary is objectively a positive finding, and therefore we applied a green rating to this indicator. And we looked at individual jurisdictions here as well, and you'll see that again, Ireland is above the United Kingdom, which is approximately 62%. We're above New Zealand this time, which is approximately 60%. However, we're below Denmark at approximately 75%. Something that you might not pick up straight away from this graph is that Ireland's trust has increased slightly from 2021 to 2023, whereas for each of these individual jurisdictions, there's a decline. And again, across the OECD, there's a decline in the average. So that's quite a positive finding for Ireland. In addition to looking at trust in the courts, we also looked at the public's perception of independence of the judiciary and the courts. And these data are taken from Eurobarometer, so it's an EU benchmark that we used here. And you'll see for every year from 2020 to 2025, Ireland is above the EU average. So for the most recent year, 2025, 71% of Irish people perceive the Irish judiciary to be independent, and that compares very favourably to the EU average of 54%. And then finally, under trust and confidence, we turn to prisons. The OECD survey does not measure trust in prisons, and at present there isn't an international data set for trust in prisons. So instead, what we did was we looked at a Department of Justice survey from 2021 to 2022, and the data available from that survey show that in 2022, 51% of the people surveyed indicated that they had confidence in the Irish prison service to provide safe and secure custody. And then just 34% of those surveyed had confidence in the Irish Prison Service's ability to effectively rehabilitate prisoners. And you'll see that there is a slight increase from 2021 to 2022. One of the recommendations that we've made in the research paper is for the Department of Justice and the Irish Prison Service to collaborate together to introduce systemic and regular data collection on public trust in prisons. And we've also recommended that the Council of Europe expand the scope of its annual penal statistics reports to include indicators on trust in prisons to enable comparative analysis. So for this indicator, the rating is white due to the lack of data. Turning then to some of the findings under the policing heading, we looked at the number of uniformed Gardaí. So you'll see from this slide from 2019 to 2024, the total number of uniformed Gardaí in Ireland was roughly 14,000 each year. There's some variation, but it's approximately 14,000 each year, so it's relatively consistent across the board. However, we also looked at the number of Gardaí per 100,000 inhabitants, and because Ireland's population has increased year on year, the number of Gardaí per 100,000 inhabitants has reduced. So it was 291 in 2019, you'll see here, and by 2024 it was 264, which is a 9% reduction. We found that the Eurobarometer, the Eurostat, I beg your pardon, data were not reliable for comparative purposes for this indicator, and that's due to differences in reporting practices across the member states. So instead, what we did was we looked at a variety of individual jurisdictions and used the averages across those 6 jurisdictions as the benchmark. So you'll see we looked at Scotland, Northern Ireland, England and Wales, Denmark and Finland, and we took the average of those 6 figures for the benchmark. So the benchmark for 2024 was 243 uniformed officers per 100,000 inhabitants. And Ireland is above this at 264. So the difference there is between 3 and 10%, and therefore the rating for this indicator was amber. And you'll see then, looking at the individual jurisdictions, Ireland is above England and Wales, which is at 238 in 2024, well above Denmark and Finland, which are at 192 and 138 respectively. And then we're below Scotland, which is at 300, and below Northern Ireland at 328. Though in relation to Northern Ireland, it should be borne in mind the particular political and historical importance of the police in that jurisdiction when comparing those figures. We also looked at the net increase or decrease in the number of uniformed Gardaí in Ireland across the same period. So you'll see here the recruitment numbers for each year. There's a significant reduction in the numbers in 2021, and that was due to the closure of the academy around COVID. You'll also see the retirement numbers and resignation numbers, and then we pool those together to get either a net increase or decrease each year. And you'll see, for example, in 2024, we have a net increase of 227 uniformed Gardaí compared with on the previous year of a net decrease of 102. And overall, from 2019 to 2024, we see a net increase of 233 Gardaí. And then the final indicator that I wanted to highlight is the one on detection rates. So just at the outset, to explain what we mean by detection, it's not prosecution, it's detection, and it means where at least one person has been identified by An Garda Síochána as being responsible for the offence and has been charged in relation to same. Now, cross-jurisdictional comparisons are not reliable for detection rates, and that's because of the differences in reporting and offence classifications across the member states. So what we did instead was we compared the detection rates across a selection of offence categories, so homicide offences, sexual offences, and theft offences, and we compared those rates against each other. And we also compared the initial detection rates against the updated detection rates. And just to explain that a little bit, the initial detection rate is recorded 8 months post the calendar year in which an offence is reported to An Garda Síochána. And then 12 months later, the detection rates are updated, and that's the updated detection rate. So for homicide offences, you'll see that the detection rate is relatively high. The updated rate in 2022, for example, was 85%. It was at its highest in 87%, in 2021 at 87%, and at its lowest in 2019 at approximately 72%. And you'll see that, as you would expect to see, the updated detection rate is higher than the initial detection rate for each year. And I'll just skip to the theft and related offences. You'll see that's relatively consistent, lower than the homicide detection rate. It's in and around 35% approximately. So it was 33% in 2022, which was actually the lowest updated rate in the period that we reviewed. And it was at its highest at 38% in 2020. And then just finally on sexual offences, you'll see that those rates are quite low, and that can be quite a stark finding when compared to the other offences. So you'll see in 2022, the updated rate was just 16%, and that the initial rate for the same year was 9%. It was at its highest in 2019 at 20.1%, and at its lowest in 2022 at 16%. It's important, however, to take into consideration with those low detection rates a number of things. So, for example, reporting has increased in Ireland and across the EU in recent years, and this includes the reporting of incidents that occurred many years ago. And in Ireland is, of course, the additional context of the historic systemic sexual abuses that occurred. And given the context within which sexual offences generally occur, so intimate, private settings, investigations largely depend on victims' accounts, and historical cases often have different evidence availability that may impact overall detection figures. So to take account for that, we have made a recommendation that the detection rates of historical and contemporary crime incidents should be published separately to account for this reality. So I'm going to hand you over to my colleague Ray Byrne now. As Mark already outlined, Ray is a member of our advisory board, formerly of the Law Reform Commission, where I had the pleasure to work with him for a number of years, and where he played a central role in shaping modern Irish legal reform.
Thanks, Suzanne. And so, as Susanna said, I'm just going to go through a couple of aspects of the report on the courts, and then also finishing off on looking at some of the findings in relation to prisons. So on the courts, what you can see here is in terms of the findings on the funding, and these are, if you like, relatively straightforward figures because we can actually see what's being spent in Ireland between 2019 and 2026. And you can see there that not only has the amount gone up, but if you look at the bottom of that graph, then you can see that the percentage increases have also beaten inflation over that time. So that's good news in terms of the amount of money that is actually being allocated to the court system. So that's the bit of good news. If we then go on to the next slide and have a look at how we compare that, and again, bearing in mind, as Susanna said, that it's difficult sometimes to make comparisons across different jurisdictions, partly because when you examine what is a court in Ireland versus what's a court in other European countries, that's often a difficult comparator to make. But we can look across some of the jurisdictions that we're very familiar with and that are very similar to our own. So again, the report looked at UK, all the UK jurisdictions. And when we look at it then from the point of view of per capita expenditure, then we can see that Ireland is trailing behind. For example, if we just kind of take Scotland there as a comparator, as a jurisdiction that we're familiar with, we've got a lot of close connections with, and the population is pretty similar. So about 5 million in both jurisdictions. We can see there that in terms of those 2022 figures, we're at 3180 per capita, and Scotland is at 3710. Again, you can see Northern Ireland, the figure is very, very high by comparison. But as Suzanne has made the point, the justice system and the court system in general in Northern Ireland has probably got a lot more expenditure per capita for different reasons. So when we look at those figures, I suppose the conclusion is the good news is that certainly the expenditure has increased and beaten inflation over the last number of years, but there's certainly room for improvement because our per capita expenditure is low. But again, in very, very recent times, I suppose we should add, as the report has added, increase in the number of judges. As you know, between 2023 and 2026, 44 extra judges across all of the jurisdictions have been appointed. And I suppose that has also led to some improvements in the overall operation of the court system, which is the next issue that the report looked at. And I'm just going to comment on a couple of aspects of that in terms of the average case disposition times in Ireland. So case disposition times, we're talking there about cases that have actually been completed and determined in the courts from the district court up to and including the Supreme Court. If you exclude the Supreme Court on the civil side and the criminal side, you can see that if we just look even at 2024, the disposition times on civil and criminal matters, excluding the Supreme Court, are pretty much the same at 501 days for civil dispositions and 503 days for criminal matters. And I'm sure all of you have done your mental arithmetic there to know that that's about 16 months disposition time from start to finish. So again, in terms of that, that's important to look at. And in the report itself, there's a lot more detail on what that means in terms of clearance rates in the courts, in the first instance courts. There's still a bit of falling behind in terms of clearance rates. So that's also important. Whereas in the Court of Appeal and the Supreme Court, not only are you looking there, if you look at the third line at disposition times, that's coming down on average, and the Supreme Court and the Court of Appeal are actually clearing more cases than are being filed every year. So that's also very positive in terms of those figures to some extent, although again, in the first instance jurisdictions up until 2024, the clearance rates were not as good as the incoming numbers. But I think we could possibly say that in the next iteration of these justice indicators, we might see improvements with the increase in the number of judges, which has really only hit the courts in the last couple of years. So that I think is important. Then when we go on to the next slide, we're looking at trying to do a comparison over different Council of Europe jurisdictions. And again, looking at those differences, it is very difficult to make a like-for-like comparison. We're talking a lot of the time about very much apples and oranges there. But in general, it's not a great picture. The actual average times in terms of case dispositions in Ireland are 3 times a Council of Europe average. So even when you take account of the differences between what's a court in Ireland versus what's a court in France, then the disposition times are very, very lengthy in Ireland by comparison with other jurisdictions. So what would you be looking at there in terms of improvements? Some of those might be to do with the increase in the use of technology. And again, we've seen in a lot of the surveys that have been done post-COVID that there's a lot of positive attitudes, particularly within the solicitor's profession, to using technology, remote courts, and so on, and technology in general that may very well improve those disposition times. But that's very much, in a sense, an ongoing issue, and how that's actually resolved is another aspect of it. And I guess as well, when you're looking at disposition times, we're looking very much at the tip of the iceberg, because we're not looking there at settlements or mediated cases, which no doubt, when you look at actual cases that are resolved in court, probably the tip of the iceberg. And when we do this presentation in a few years' time, people will be saying, what's an iceberg? But for the time being, I think we still have a few icebergs. So obviously settled cases and mediation cases are not included there. So there's some further work that needs to be done on the data there. Looking at prisons then, and aspects of what was in the report, the Justice Indicators on prisons, just taking a couple of very small aspects of that. For today's seminar, we're looking at the actual numbers, the occupancy rates. That's the number of people that are actually in prison, and what the rate of that versus the capacity of the prison system is. So we're looking there at, you can see very clearly between 2019 and 2025, quite a significant increase, particularly after COVID left these shores. We're talking about a big increase in terms of actual numbers. The actual numbers there going up to 5797 by the end of 2025. And the other very important aspect of this is to look at how that compares with the capacity of the prison system to look at this. And you can see here that in 2019, you had average capacity of about 93%. And by the end of 2025, that had climbed, believe it or not, to a percentage of 123%. And my maths is not great, but that doesn't look great from the point of view of the capacity of the prison system. And Suzanne has done further updating of that, and she looked at the system as it was 3 days ago on the 16th, and unfortunately that had gone up to 125% occupancy levels. So that's really poor. And when you look at it from the point of view of a comparison there, we're talking about Ireland going up in terms of the capacity and the numbers, and a lot of other Council of Europe jurisdictions going in the opposite direction down. So we are very much disimproving there in terms of that. And if we look at the next slide, then we can see that comparing that with other Council of Europe, and in fact, the examples here are all, as it happens, EU member states as well. You can see here that we are going in the wrong direction. And so that's really something that needs to be looked at. And the solutions to that are, to some extent, again, technology. We can see in some other jurisdictions, electronic monitoring, both for remand and convicted prisoners, is a possibility that one could look at. And then if we look at the very last figure, which is related to this whole issue of the capacity of the system to take in the numbers of prisoners, we have this very strange situation where the average length of a prison sentence that's actually served in Ireland is extremely low in terms of the number of months that are actually served. When we look at it from 2019, you can see that the average length of a sentence that is actually served is 5.3 months. And then that does go up in 2023 to 6.9. And that's been more or less where it's been for the last few years. So that's a kind of a peculiar statistic, of course, and particularly when you compare it with other jurisdictions in Council of Europe and mostly EU member states. These are all EU member states that are being compared there in specific terms, Scotland and Slovakia. But the average length of time that's actually served in other jurisdictions is quite high, over a year. And so you're looking here at some very particular issues that need to be examined. Why is it that, of course, the number of people who are actually serving very low actual sentences imposed is also quite low? So we've got a very particular situation where, although we have a community services legislation going back to the 1980s, that is underutilized. That certainly seems to be the position. And we also have a long awaited community sanctions bill that would actually give courts, especially in the district court, more options to choose from in terms of non-custodial sentences that could improve in terms of rehabilitation. So going back to Suzanne's point about a lack of confidence in the Irish population about the rehabilitative nature of the prison system, I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done there, particularly in terms of the kind of integrated work that's done between the probation and prison services, say in Scotland. There are some improvements here in Ireland in that respect, but I think a lot more, to coin a cliche, needs to be done in that respect. So those are just some of the issues that came up from the report, and those are the contributions that I'm making to today's seminar. So thanks very much to the Law Society for inviting me, and I can certainly say I speak on behalf of all the members of the advisory group about the great work that's being done in the centre, particularly by Suzanne and her colleagues.
Thanks, Ray, and thanks, Suzanne. And maybe it's worth taking the presentation down for now, and we can maybe dedicate the screen to the contributors here. Look, first of all, thank you for those who submitted some questions. We'll get around to those as well. And please, I'd encourage all of you, if you have any questions, to please submit them in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. What we've had there is a very quick summary of what is a very detailed report. There's a lot more detail. I encourage you to log on to the Law Society website, where the report is available in full to download, and you can go through all the details. And I hope it's a resource for you and others for now and in the future as well. But maybe just to turn to some initial questions, first to you, Suzanne, really, is just, would you be able to summarize what you see the main recommendations of the report are? Because there's a lot of detail in there, but the main recommendations are very much around needing more information.
Yeah, definitely. I think the more that we looked at the data, the more we realized the data that we have. So first to say, we do have a lot of data. I mean, obviously you can see, like, from the findings, we looked at over 101 official sources of data, and we pulled all those together. But what we found in analyzing those data was, because they haven't been brought together again, they've raised more questions than they raised answers. So a lot of our recommendations are around better data collection, and I alluded to some of those. So in relation to the sexual offences detection rates, for example, we really don't know. Obviously, additional resourcing has been put in place in recent years to set up specialist units in An Garda Síochána to deal with that type of offending. But we really don't know the extent to which that's been successful, because of the fact that the historical offences are combined with the contemporary offences. We have a lot of missing data in relation to the courts. For example, we don't have any data on the case disposition times of civil matters in the district court or the circuit court. As Ray highlighted already, we have no information as to the number of cases that are concluded by way of settlement. And actually, the annual reports of the court service do mention, they're very open by the fact that they don't have that data, but actually that the majority of civil matters are resolved by way of settlement. So actually, if we get better at collecting those data, then the findings might be much more positive. It's probably that actually the majority of civil matters are cleared each year, but because we don't have those data, we don't actually know. And it seems that that a large portion aren't. So most of the recommendations are around better data collection.
Well, I think one of the statements around this report when it was put out first was that we can't understand what's happening unless we measure it. So obviously the data is going to be key to that. And maybe Ray, turn to you in terms of the particular findings of the data we do have. Is there one or two in particular that jumped out at you across the board? I mean, you have everything, as you say here, from trust to policing, courts, and the prisons. Are there a particular area that you personally were surprised by or felt we should pay more attention to?
I think, say, for example, on the civil disposition times, I think we know for quite a long time, and the report really reaffirms this, that we're not performing as well as we could on civil disposition times. So I think the report has highlighted that. The World Bank has previously highlighted this, that when they look at Ireland as a good place to do business in from the justice sector point of view, we really score very highly across many of the metrics, but it's just in the civil disposition times that we don't look as good. And so that I think is an important area for a lot of attention that would be deserved from the point of view of Ireland as a good place to attract, if you like, justice to. So that's one area. The other area that struck me was on the prison side. And I think, again, that's an area where we know that the occupancy rate is too high. It's unsafe. The report makes the point very clearly that all of the indicators are that if you are at over 90% occupancy rate, then it's unsafe. And that's not good from the point of view of prison officers or the people who are in prison, the prisoners. So from that point of view, I think we have to look at that. And I think there are, again, opportunities there, not just because we're in that emergency situation, but as a number of reports have pointed out, there are also very good justice reasons why we should be looking at alternatives, including community sanctions. And there is a bill that's been hanging around since 2014 in draft form, the Community Sanctions Bill, which I think would be a very good piece of legislation to bring to the Oireachtas and get that over the line. So those are two areas that just kind of struck me.
And you've sort of indirectly answered one or two of the questions that have come in on the Q&A section. Again, I encourage people to put any questions they have in there around that issue of, in terms of community sanctions currently not being used in the way that maybe they are in other jurisdictions. With that in mind, I mean, Ray, you mentioned technology a couple of times in your presentation as well, and there's a couple of questions in there for, do we feel that the digitization of the court services and the courts obviously themselves, what impact that might make on some of these indicators, and are we doing enough in that space?
Yeah, well, I know COVID is now thankfully in the rearview mirror, and that's 6 years ago when it hit, and the courts had to respond very quickly to that. And luckily, there had been some investment in technology, if you like, video technology as its absolute basic in the courts. In the last couple of years, there's been a big investment there. So the court service are saying that maybe a few years ago you had 120 court venues around the country with video technology, and they're hoping to increase that to 160 by the end of this year. So again, I think that's very important, that there is some capital investment being made in technology. Of course, the other aspect of this is, in a sense, the digitalization of the justice system, the move from paper in the traditional sense, if you like, the wet ink approach to things towards digitalization. So I think that's very important. The courts are committed to doing that. So we're seeing the kind of case management systems that have been very well piloted and tried in the Court of Appeal and the Supreme Court being rolled out across the court service system. So I think, again, looking at it from the point of view of the attitude of the legal profession, particularly the kind of surveys that have been done by the top of the top law firms, there's a very positive attitude to that, with caveats about what kinds of cases still need to be dealt with, if you like, through oral evidence where people are present in court. But a huge amount of activity, I think, can be done, which again is of benefit to everybody in terms of reducing commuting time for clients, solicitors, judges, and the court service in general. So I think the investment in technology is there. Whether we're not talking here about robot courts and taking the human out of the court system, but we are certainly talking about digitalization, and that is certainly something that's possible on both the civil and the criminal side.
Very good. And maybe back to you, Suzanne. There was a question there in relation to what other research might be available on how other jurisdictions are achieving lower case disposal times than in Ireland, without the affecting the quality of justice, of course, is the caveat here. But are you aware of other research that's out there in that area, and are there lessons for Ireland to learn?
What I can say is that we had ongoing engagement with the European Commission in relation to the data. We had many conversations with them, and we asked them those very questions because we noticed that some jurisdictions that had, say, around case clearance rates, a case clearance rate that was much lower than Ireland, and then are now clearing more than 100% of their cases each year. Unfortunately, it seems, based on the European Commission's advice to us, that there's no one size fits all approach. So there's no magic wand that we can wave and say, oh, this is definitely what's going to help. So that's why I go back to, we need more data, because we need more granular data to pinpoint which courts are faster, which matters are taking longer, which even looking at the district court, which particular district, is there differences between one district and another? So really, unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be any particular simple solution that we can apply.
No, and I suppose if it was simple, anybody could do it. But I think if we should take some, I think, comfort from this report, which shows, in my view, two things. One is the Court of Appeal, where clear investment in a number of judges has shown a substantial reduction in the case clearance rate and the disposition time. And I think that is a very clear indication that investment in this, not only the judges, but the supports around that, can make a substantial difference. And I think that was one area. And the other one I take on board as well, I think, is from both of you have made the case that, that we're not necessarily recording all of the relevant information at this point in time, and those matters that are settled. Now, obviously, matters can get settled in other jurisdictions too. But I think there is some optimism that if we are recording the data better, but also it's clear that the investment in the judicial system over the last number of years has paid some dividends. Would it be accurate in that?
Yes, I think that's right. And probably just to also come back on the point about settlements, we've made a recommendation that if it's impossible to collect those data, which it may very well be, that matters that haven't progressed after a certain length of time are treated as having been resolved by way of settlement for statistic purposes, because as the courts say themselves, the majority of cases are resolved that way. So actually there probably is a much more positive finding to be had there if we just change the way we record data, essentially.
Yeah. There's a question here of, I see in regard to one of the main stats picked up in the media was substantial rise in sexual offences, and to what extent can we be worried about this increase? And could it be actually a positive sign in the sense that the incidence of sexual offences is being reported more accurately? I suppose the caveat I give is that the report didn't go into the whys, I suppose, but it did. I think we have more accurately around the details. of what? But Suzanne, in particular, I know you delved into this research in a bit of detail. So,
Yeah, and we had many conversations about that because it could be a negative finding, and I think that it was reported on that way in the media because it makes for a good headline. But actually, it could be a positive finding because when you compare that with the high level of trust in An Garda Síochána, it could actually be that people are more willing to come and report those offences to An Garda Síochána. We just don't know. We do. I know that's not a great answer, but we do just need more research in that regard. And as I said as well, a lot of the offences pertain to incidents that happened a number of years ago. So we know in 2023, for example, that the CSO did a survey on sexual offences, and 30% of offences that were recorded that year were related to incidents where there was a gap of at least 10 years between the incident and when it was first reported. So 30% is almost a third of the entirety of the numbers. So that's why unfortunately, it's not a great answer. We don't know. And again, the disaggregation between the historic offences and the contemporary offences would give us that information to a certain extent, along with additional research into the causes as well.
well, Ray, I might just turn to you and just think about your long experience, whether it be the Law Reform Commission and the law in general, and obviously now as part of the advisory board here. Um, in all the year in that time, do you feel you're optimistic or pessimistic about the future of the justice system here? And in particular, what would you highlight as the key areas we should be focusing on?
I think broadly we should be positive and hopeful, and there's been huge changes over the time that I've looked at the legal system and the court service. So again, over the last 25 years, in a sense, since the court service was established, that has brought huge improvements in terms of, even with the limited amount of resourcing that was initially available, you're talking there about a huge transformation in the justice system. But there are clearly huge challenges still there that have been identified in the justice report. But what I would say is that there's a willingness, I think, to be more open about the challenges as well as the opportunities that are there. And we have increased the resources, maybe not as much as other jurisdictions, but I think, again, when you look at the opportunities that are available in an English-speaking common law jurisdiction that is actually paying attention to things like the need to improve the technological approaches to justice. And yes, we've got challenges, and by gum, when you look at some of the proposals that are being made that are somewhat negative on both the civil legal aid side and the criminal legal aid side, these are not great things, but on balance, and particularly when I think back to the time I was in the Law Reform Commission, if we think about the Kelly report, which in a sense picked up a lot of Law Reform Commission recommendations, if you have a little bit of patience and a little bit of hope, then one can see improvements over a long period of time before all the grey hair becomes white. So that's my hope for the future.
Well, look, I think it's a wonderfully positive note to end this webinar on. There's one outstanding question someone had around the increased investment in the courts and judiciary. Should also look at resources for other associated agencies, and that's quite correct. I think we'd all agree with that. And while it's not captured in this particular report, it is part of our rationale for this report is that we will build upon it to look at other indicators in the future. And so we will update this data hopefully each year and then expand upon it as well so that we will have a broader remit. And again, as I say, go back to the basic purpose of why do the report at all. It's to shed a light on what is currently happening, what we know and what we don't know happening within the justice system, and to give policymakers and commentators and opinion formers, I hope, and the practitioners who are involved in the process a greater understanding of what is going on, and what we can do about it then can become part of the bigger and broader discussion. So thank you all for joining, and on your behalf, I'd like to thank Ray and Suzanne for presenting here today. There is a team behind the Centre for Justice and Law Reform. I'd like to thank all the advisory board members and the staff here in the Law Society who put huge work into the report, and I know we'll continue to do that on behalf of the profession, with the simple purpose of improving the justice system, making it more accessible for all here in Ireland. And obviously, that's a really important purpose for the Law Society. So thank you all again. Again, just on some housekeeping, we will circulate the presentation. The report is available on our website. It is being recorded and will be circulated to those who weren't able to make it in person. But thank you all in great numbers for attending here today.